Family, welcome to Let's Rap. Today we're sitting with Camryn and Ernest. We're sitting with some giants today, folks, and we're going to dig into some issues that cross the sectors and the realms for us to understand the struggle, liberation, and what it looks like. So let's rap. I have today with us Camryn Smith and Earnest Smith. So Camryn and Ernest are both residents of Old East Durham, and they're both community activists and organizers. For Camryn, she's been serving in place-based development work for over 20 years, both stateside and abroad. Camryn is one of the founding members of CIP, Communities in Partnership, a grassroots organization and education group based in Old East Durham, and serves as the executive director. CIP focuses on addressing policy and systemic inequality for communities of color and materially poor people within Durham, focusing on social determinants of health, economic development, gentrification, housing. Camryn is current RWJF Culture of Health Leader, Cohort 3, co-chair of Organizing Against Racism in Durham, as well as a current member of the Racial Equity Taskforce for the City of Durham. She also serves on the executive and steering committees for the Equitable Food-Oriented Development, which is a national collaborative of food systems run by Black and brown communities to reshape the narrative surrounding food, community, and economic development centered in Black and brown liberation. Camryn and her husband Ernest are proud parents of 5 adult children, 4 of whom currently live in the community, and their shepherd mix Charlie and their corgi grand dog Oswald. And now for Ernest, who is our civil rights attorney in the house. He is also a community organizer, a consultant, a community advocate, and a co-director with his beautiful wife along neighborhood allies. Ernest spent a year first as an intern and then as attorney with the law office of John Burris, a nationally known civil rights attorney in Oakland, learning and growing in the profession of civil rights. He has recently returned home in Durham to continue work in civil rights law. He is an asset-based community development organizer that focuses on training and consulting with organizations, institutions, and churches on racial equity and community engagement. He and his family have been serving in place-based development for over 15 years throughout North Carolina. Ernest, along with his family, also have experienced the international faith-based humanitarian aid and development communities, serving as Roma population in Romania for 2+ years, working on community building, education, community health, and inequality. The Smiths received Community Neighborhood Awards for their community work in Durham Inter-Neighborhood Council in 2015. Ernest is the founding member of Communities in Partnership as well, a grassroots community organization that he serves with his wife that creates voices for the residents of Durham. He served as the vice chair of Northeast Central Durham Leadership Council. He served on the Leadership Council of Forward Cities Organizing Against Racism in North Carolina, Real Durham, fostering alternative drug enforcement, and the president of the Civil Rights Association at NCCU Law. Ernest received his Juris Doctorate from North Carolina Central University of Law in May 2019 and passed in July 2019 the NC Bar, and has a bachelor's in leadership in the public sector from North Carolina State University. Welcome, Ernest and Camryn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for joining us. This is going to be a really special time. I'm excited to kind of hear your guys' thoughts. So, you just got back from Oakland, and so with everything going on right now, from George Floyd to COVID-19 to the incidents in McDougal 6 months ago, we're still healing from as a city. What are you guys feeling right now in this moment?
I'll let you start.
I think for the first time I've had a level of somewhat of reticence in my hopefulness and us moving forward, because I think the unfortunate reality that it has taken so many of our people violently dying for the powers that be to get it. But while I'm saying that, I also have a great deal of anger at that it takes so many of us to go through so much pain for people to kind of have a wake-up moment. I think Durham is a very progressive city. I also think we think that we're in a place that we're not, in terms of how we see systems and how we equitably distribute power and help to build systems that communities can have to maintain themselves for themselves. I don't think we're anywhere near that yet. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what the city and what the county is going to do substantively to transfer power and resources. And what I mean by that is money. I mean real estate.
Right.
I mean, technical support and services for Black and brown communities, and I'm not talking about giving it to colonized folk, and I'm meaning colonized Black and brown people. I'm talking about people that are accountable to directly impacted populations, that have credibility in their communities, and that will actually do what's best for all of Black and brown Durham, not just the talented 10th.
Okay.
So, big question. So, what am I filling in this time? So, on the day after Memorial Day, you know, I woke up and looked at my news feed, and I was seeing the story about George Floyd. Folks who know me know that I am not on social media that much, and I don't respond. I don't get on Facebook. I'll be lucky to get on Facebook and acknowledge the people wishing me happy birthday every year because, you know, we're Facebook friends. But that morning I woke up and I read that news, and it did something to my heart. And you know, I began to express some of my thoughts on Facebook at that point. And just to think that our society, and from my limited experience and the time that I was in Oakland working with John Burris, which was an amazing experience, but every day we're dealing with police misconduct. And it would be different if it was just cases here and there. We have dozens of cases of police misconduct that we're working on. People shot, people dying. And, you know, I would have this discussion with folks out in California, because California is supposed to be this place where, you know, it's liberal in some senses, and it has all this, everyone thinks of them as a left coast and all these attributes, but Black and brown people are dying at the hands of police more out there, and it isn't just a population thing. It is a fact that in our nation, built into the systems of policing, there's this sense of power, this sense of, you know, I can do what I want, and you could see that so clearly when, and I watched just a minute of the video, and I've not watched the whole thing, and I refuse to, because I see it. I see the dead bodies laying on the morgue. And so it's built into the fabric of this nation of how we devalue Black and brown bodies in this country. And so that's the reason why I chose to work in the field that I'm working in, is because I see how there's a great book, Locking Up Our Own, where there was a time when we had hope that if we could just get some, you know, African American police officers in the system, but the system eats them for lunch. In order for them to survive in the system, they begin to take on the characteristics of this white supremacist system. And so we see that, and Camryn mentioned losing hope. You know, I hate to say this, and I've never said this, but the fact that we have who we have sitting at 1600 has allowed people to expose who they are, right? And so it allows people to see what we're facing. So that made this moment a little different than the moments that have been nationalized before. And you think about it, it takes that something of that nature in order to begin to wake people up, to recognize. And still people don't want to recognize. We have those who just continue to, even people in the same skin as you and I, still wanting to say that it's a few bad apples. No, it's a broken system. And we've got to address the issues at hand that has caused this broken system to be such that we have more Black and brown people incarcerated, because that's how it's been designed, and we need to address that.
Yeah, I'm feeling that. So I heard decentralizing power, and then we're thinking about, and it almost feels like both of you together just painted this picture that what exists now. We have is a masquerade. It's the illusion. So from progressive, like, okay, here's the fix. The best we got is a safe space, right? That's not safe for us, but that, again, that is a broken remedy. But then you're also describing police brutality, and and I'm seeing it as well. And you have whole half police departments are like, we'll quit if we can't abuse black folk.
Yeah.
Like that's the energy.
Well,
that
they'll challenge you. They'll say that's not what we're saying.
Right, but
that is what they're saying.
That's the vibe, right? For us, that's the vibe. Like, dang, well, if that. And so, I guess my next question would probably be around when it comes to Durham and thinking about. And we'll just walk into this forest when it comes to decentralizing power for us. Again, struggle and tension, but what are some things that you feel like have been barriers for black people that have encumbered us? Like, we're just talking, this is us talking. What are some barriers when it comes to decentralizing the power that destroys us and that continues to destroy us on all spectrums?
So we're working in the framework of a broken system, and and we keep trying to tweak the system, trying to, if we elect this person, and they make these promises, and and the money gets involved, and even politicians who may start out to want to do good are swayed by, in order for me to be reelected, I've got to, wash these hands. I've got to do this sort of stuff and rub this back. And so, so we're working within the framework of a broken system. And I don't see how what we're doing is just not working. And so I think this moment is a critical moment right now where some people are listening. Now, the hard part is how do we take this moment where people are saying, the system's broken, there's a lot of cries for defund the police, and then a lot of different definitions of what that means. But we need to take this moment and capitalize on that in such a way that allows us to move in a different direction than we have been on before. And, it's my kids and I have this discussion, and other family members, about, a Democratic nominee for president, right? And so, so you got the Democratic nominee for president, and you've got the presumptive Republican nominee for president, and you got to pick between these two individuals, right? And so it's like, I hear voices that say, well, the Democratic nominee, this is the best that we can do, and our system has generated to the point where this is what we have to pin our hopes on, and so you got this other choice that is just like, how do we continue to say that we want change and we keep putting the same types of people into those positions, and the solutions that they bring? I mean, I'm probably going to vote for the Democratic nominee.
Sure.
But his solution was shoot him in the leg. I mean, and you can't think beyond shoot him in the leg in order to it's the same thing with a different face, with very much the same results if we continue to support this broken system as it exists. And so how do we change that? I think, like I said, in this moment, if we can begin to, as a people, coalesce around some central ideas and make them, these are the points we're going to stand on, and I don't care if you either accept this or, you don't. And at the same time, we've got people using this moment to say, all sorts of corporations saying Black Lives Matter. They don't mean it. Mm-hmm. They don't mean it. My daughter worked for an organization, and that person is touting Black Lives Matter. My son worked for an organization, and they were touting Black Lives Matter. And my son said, look, he called back. He used to work for the company. He called back and said, I'm going to call you out on that shit, because when I worked there, this is what was happening. And fortunately, in that particular situation, the owners responded and said, we're going to do something about it. But all these people saying Black Lives Matter, they're saying it because it's expedient for them, mm-hmm. and they realize the damage that will happen if they don't. And so we've got to break the system. Do I have the answers? No. But I think now is a moment that we need to seek them, and we need to find a way to make it happen. Now, Camryn may have the answers.
I'm not gonna say I have the answers. I just know that there's a huge amount in liberal spaces. There's a huge amount of, even more so than in right-wing spaces, white liberals love to paternalize black and brown people. And at the end of the day, if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And so at any way, shape, or form, I grew up in the foothills of the North Carolina mountains. And so I went to school with people who, their granddads were in the KKK, and they told, they were like, I really like you as a friend, but I can't be friends with you, and I grew up, and so of course I figured out, well, I have to be my own people. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's a liberation in knowing where I stand with you. Mm-hmm. So if you're gonna call me to my face, then I know exactly where I stand with you. I know that you don't value my life, you don't care about the system, how it treats and interacts with me. I know you don't care about my well-being, and you definitely don't care about my humanity. Mm-hmm. Versus well-meaning white people who always want to create systems that paternalize, that create dependency, quote unquote. It's not really dependency outside of the fact is that's all you give us. Mm-hmm. You don't give us an opportunity to own our own systems. Yeah. And so we have to have conversations with a lot of people that would identify themselves as being allies.
Right. Yeah.
And how that is very damaging for black and brown people, because we know how to take care of ourselves. Mm-hmm. We know exactly what we need. We need you to give us the money back that we built for you. Mm-hmm. We need that power. We need to be autonomous in the ways that we deem that are fit for our community and for our elders and for our people. Mm-hmm. And also we have some very difficult conversations to have in intraracial conversations with our own people as black people. Mm-hmm. I heard somebody say the other day, and I know everybody's heard, we don't need white folks because we're too busy tearing up our own house. And it's true. Mm-hmm. It's some very difficult conversations that we have to have. And Durham is a hotbed for that. That as brilliant as Hayti was, there was also issues that I sit in elders in my community who were not a part of that talented tent. Mm-hmm. And they tell me stories of how their family was treated and disregarded and relegated for any reason, because they didn't have the education, they didn't have the right connections, or because they couldn't pass that brown paper bag test.
Yeah.
So those are conversations we have to have with our own people. Because I do know that our people who've been much more severely directly impacted are tired of being used. Mm-hmm. They're tired of being left out, and they're tired of not given the same opportunities as the pipeline babies that are in our community. That needs to stop. Part of the work that we do, one of our founding co-members, Ali Abdul-Rahman, says that her part of what she is supposed to do, because she's a pipeline baby, is to bust up the pipeline. She says, she adds a few other colorful words in there, but I'll just keep it, we need to bust the pipeline up and stop thinking that the talented, the exceptional Negro syndrome that we have bought into, that needs to stop. We will never be strong as a people if we are always defaulting to one being the only one sitting in the room, one, getting power here and there. No, that needs to stop.
Would you describe how, because some people may not understand what the pipeline baby is.
So the pipeline baby is when the system that was created specifically to harness the intellect and the brilliance in white children, but because it gets called out on not being diverse, how they let a few children into that is kind of this narrow pipeline. And how they allow those children to go in and be allowed to go to the day schools, how they end up at Durham Academy, how they end up at the School of Science and Math, how they end up at Duke or at Harvard. And so then you have this small percentage of black elite who are basically in a lot of ways disconnected from their people and their community. Right. And they bought into the ideology that, hey, this system worked for me just fine because I did exactly what it needed for me to do and I'm benefiting. But you never look until recently, till we actually have had researchers who are black and who are pipeline babies themselves, and they're actually admitting this system isn't quite what it's cracked up to be. We have a whole lot of very negative, disproportionate health outcomes, both physical and mental. Our overall ability to create wealth is not on par with the same education or even better than our white counterparts. In terms of the outcomes for our children, they're actually reverting back. Mm-hmm. And so all of this stuff, the system is doing exactly what it was created to do. It was never created to benefit black and brown people. It was created to benefit off of our labor and off of our oppression. Right. And so when people think that, well, the system, no, it didn't. Because if you look at your white counterparts, I can guarantee you, and oftentimes they had much less stellar educational outcomes. If you look at SATs, if you look at grades, oftentimes, because what's the saying that our elders told us? We have to not only be as good as white folks, but we have to be 2 times better. So those that are able to make it, oftentimes are achieving at such a high level. But when they get out into the workforce, because they don't have that intergenerational wealth, because they don't have those connections, their father's not on all these board of directors that can kind of lead them in to where they start off at this $250,000 a year job with all the benefits. And then if you are led into that, I'm just going to say this as well. We all know how the system works because you are the one in your family that's making it. So what is your responsibility? It's to take care of everybody else in your family. So even if that was the case, which is not oftentimes the case, your wealth is directly impacted. Wealth in white families, as Racial Equity Institute says, flows from parent to child. In black and brown communities, when children make it out, quote unquote, it goes from child to parent to aunt and uncle to cousin and everybody. You're taking care of everybody all over the place because that's our responsibility. That is the one blessing and a curse, quote unquote, that our people have not lost from our African identity. We are responsible, but the system will tear us up because it's not created to work to our benefit as individuals in that system to be able to take care of everybody. It's just not feasible in this capitalistic model that we have. It's just not.
I'm following that, Camryn. So when it comes to decolonizing, when it comes to, and you mentioned kind of this, I guess, post, or maybe even pre-slavery, thinking about our ancestors, where we came from. There was a moment for me in my faith walk where I connected, where I connected God making us in the way that we are completely, and I feel like even thinking about Gandhi, I think this is universal, it's an eternal piece, but that we're worthy of honor, respect, and this dignity. And so, and for me, I think connecting that to like finding myself from that point, I began to decolonize my faith. Like even while in this space, right? Hearing things that contradicted that. And so for me, hearing what you're saying, when it comes to value, when it comes to this code switching that people forget even what code, like that, it ends up being like just a milieu of losses where some people never switch. At one point it was a survival thing. I'm like, oh, this brother doesn't know code. Like they're not around, fam. Like you ain't they're gone. They're not in the room. And you're like, hold on. It feels like, this was crazy. Sometimes it feels like, how hard it is, painful it is for us to see white folk put on blackface. It feels like at times, and just kind of just say it feels like you're sitting in a room with white people wearing blackface, and they're mocking. Like it feels like a mockery to the issues, but you're like, yo, your mama's black, your daddy's black, and so I think for me, I instantly am like, okay, God made us in this way, and this is before slaveholder religion. This is how we as a people are collective in our thought and into generation, the matriarchs and the babies, right? And so I look at Durham and hearing even what you're saying about the politics of Biden, this how we're just put like lesser two evils, and that's like all day, every day, right? Is black people like, what's going to hurt me less? And that I think is painful, and I think thinking about value is a big piece that you mentioned. Like, so there's value from outside, and then there's value from inside. And so I guess my next question would be, how does Black Durham work to value ourselves between those generational boundaries and the bag boundaries? Like we're talking about cats with the bag and without, and so you're talking about the rich and the poor in our own classroom. Yeah. How do we work to deal with, and here's the hook to me, how do we work to have that conversation amongst us in a way that's not influenced, and maybe imagine for a second, as you guys answer this, not influenced by white supremacists tearing, pulling, oppressing, self-hatred, like, it's all infused, but what if we were just to have that conversation across those generational, because I think we did before slavery, and I think, my dad's from West Africa, so like, growing up, I had a lot of tradition that was like real village, not like pretend village, but like legit, and so, for me, I imagine that, but I wonder, what is it like for you guys to imagine a collective conversation around our value that doesn't include the lesser two evils or the options that continue to distract from the real issues.
I think there's a lot of confusion amongst our people. The reality is to have that conversation without the influence of white supremacy at this point in time is impossible because we're also influenced by it. And there's ways that I'm still decolonizing my construct, that Ernest is. I mean, even bad elders who laid down the foundation, like Angela Davis, and Kathleen Cleaver, people, they're all everybody's in this process because none of us know what a world looks like or is without being colonized. Everybody on the face of this planet in some way, even if they have not come in contact with colonizers, their world is still being impacted because of the environmental and ecological disasters that we have going on now. There is no one who knows. And so how do we have these conversations knowing it's going to be tough? It's almost like we're going to have to walk through quicksand, but somebody has to do it. And the reason why we have to do it is because of our kids, because of those who are coming behind us. We have to start somewhere, having very difficult conversations and allowing ourselves, because there's a whole segment, that depends on who you're talking about, because there's folks that only want to be in black only spaces. If you got to me like 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I would have been kind of okay in black spaces, but I didn't want anybody to know that because of where I was in my ideology behind who Camryn was and my faith and all this other stuff, because I had a very colonistic lens of thinking, centering white comfort. So everybody's on this trajectory in some way, shape, or form. And how do we have spaces that we can hold very sacred as much as possible, but allow people to kind of learn and grow without it poisoning the rest of the outcomes. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, it's a very see. This is the thing about about white culture. It's no black and white.
Right.
We're diunal. We're not dichotomous. Dichotomous culture is not. It's a gray most of the time in every other color combination that you can think of, and that's why it's very uncomfortable oftentimes for people who are addicted to the easy, quick fix, because it's not that. It's just not. This is a lot of internal work that we have to do as individual people. And from my perspective, individual beings created in the image of God. I mean, because, then we come into broken ideology and all this other stuff, and also how Christianity and other forms of religion have been used to even entrench and to moralize and give an ethical imperative as to the reason why we should do X, Y, and Z this way, all the while it's dehumanizing black and brown people. Specifically, I can speak from my experience as a black person. And so it's a both and. It's a very difficult conversation to have. And I think it has to really be centered in a lot of love and a lot of relationships. And especially, I know that my husband and I have been on this trajectory we've been married for 30 years this year. For well over half of that, for at least 20 years of our marriage, we centered whiteness. We put our kids, in a white world. We lived in a white community. My husband worked in white America, and it almost killed our kids in terms of their mentality about who they were and who their people were. And so we did the direct opposite, and we had to do it real quick to save our kids. And get them back on the right path. And thank God it worked. But having some very clear conversations and knowing it's very difficult to sit in those spaces. It's very painful. And if we don't build very strong relationships where we love us above everyone else, because we have been taught, the reason why I say that is people like, you're making a God out of black people. No, I'm not. I'm trying to give us some idea that it's okay for us to see and humanize ourselves. We put the comfort above everyone else's liberation above our own. And because we do that, it's going to take a radical change in mentality. Because we think we're expendable. We just don't care. We'll fight for white kids before we'll fight for our own kids. That to me is from the pit of hell. I'm not saying white children aren't valuable. They are. They're created in the image of God. But everything holds and protects them. Nobody's holding up and protecting our babies. especially the dark-skinned ones. No one is doing that. And my thing is, that is what I will do. It doesn't mean that I won't protect white. If somebody was coming into a room to shoot down, I would try to protect all of them. But it wouldn't be that I'm grabbing all the little lights, the little blonde-haired, blue-eyed babies without thinking about mine, our people who I'm connected to. It would be, and I'm just saying, the bias in the data shows how teachers and other people who interact with our children, how they defer to whiteness, white adjacent. And so when you're in a stressful situation, what are you going to do? Who are you going to protect? Who are you going to look out for?
An experience that we had that I felt like really helped shape some of the things that we understand now was our time in Romania. And it was, I describe it often as this. So when you're here, when you're Black in America, this is, you know the experience. And you're living it, you're moving and you're surviving and you're, a little side note. So as she talked about how we could come together, I thought about the fact that, how often have people's paychecks depended upon them not bucking the system, right? And not telling the truth, and so because the system is so built and the people in power have a lot of times control of our paychecks, we're often, we either wholeheartedly support the system or we recognize that if we buck the system, that it's going to change our lives and we're already at a deficit and so it's broken. But anyway, that's a whole side point that I don't want to get into. So when we were in Romania, one of the things that there was racism there, right? We experienced our own racism, but we were also afforded an opportunity to see racism that wasn't necessarily affecting us directly. We saw how the white missionaries would gravitate to the lighter skinned Roma and how they would lift up the people who looked like them, and how, Camryn often had described it as like stepping back into the Jim Crow era in the United States, of how the Romanians often, and the missionaries that walked with them, would treat the Roma people, especially the darker skinned ones. And so, it enabled me to see the system of oppression, and I could sort of look back at my experience in the US and look at how oppression was affecting me, because that United States racial oppression at that moment was not affecting me in the same way. And it allowed us for 2 years, a little over 2 years that we were there, the freedom to live in a way that said, when we get back, we've got to begin to challenge the system of oppression that exists. And we can do it in a way that values the voice of the people. And to your question of, how do we do it? We do it beginning, and again, it is fighting against a system that has existed for centuries. We begin by getting together. We begin by, like we began with CIP, by having potlucks, by having communal spaces where we can just, begin to engage each other on a level that allows us to see each other's humanity. And then we can begin to talk about, the issues that we face and how we can break those colonization, that colonial thinking, that systemic oppression. And so, because we got to have some honest conversations about, how we are interacting in the system and how we're supporting the system. And if we don't have those conversations, we're going to continue to allow the people who are paying us, those who are in those positions that are depending upon their pay, to support that system without challenging it. And so we've got to find ways to come together, have those honest conversations, and begin to think about a way of breaking that systemic nature of the oppression that we feel.
Yeah, well, that's good from both of y'all. So hearing about value, and you just mentioned your time in Romania, it reminds me about what we do with our hands, right? And what we produce, what we put our hands on. The rich legacy that we have in this country of being able to craft design, shape, imagine. So it felt like for a moment both of you were, like building something, right? Like in this room, right? A vision. And so I think that reminds me of Black economics, the Black dollar. And so I've heard you on real estate, like I know Camryn, you guys' involvement with food, right? Major. So I think again that gets into what we do with our hands, what we produce, what we share. I value something that's given to me that's connected to my survival. And so I think food is such a powerful, food and housing are powerful catalyst to be like, look, the issues in the MAC, this is how much it costs to build one of those buildings. This is what the land will cost. Boom, boom, boom. We need X amount from X amount for X amount. And then on this day, we're going to start construction on a new McDougal or a new Oxford or a new this or new that or a new Walmart.
That the residents own.
Right, that the residents own. No, absolutely. It's got to be collective.
Yeah.
But we can't begin to think like, okay, what is it to resist Walmart if we don't have a shop that can get that can match it? You talk about defunding the police. You can't defund if you don't have nothing to
replace it. Yeah.
Like, and a lot of old heads are like, whoa, we need to be safe over here. Whoa, time out. And then the young cats are like, no, forget the police. And I think, again, you don't have 200 brothers and sisters that's willing to train mentally, train, arm, and engage the community in that way. You can't replace Durham PD. So until you get a couple hundred brothers and sisters that are willing to say, all right, militia, let's boom, hit the streets, do shifts like they did in Oakland, right back in the Black Panther. That's from that. They did that. They punched in, right? They punched in, did a shift, went, and they were working from medical to housing to education to safety for their people and with their people. And so we don't get that kind of vibe. And so when it comes to thinking about like these big terms, it reminds like, dang, God has given us something in our hands that we need. So Black economics, Black dollar, food. Let's talk about that. How do we practice that? You're doing it with the food, but what's your experience in Durham, and then how do we continue to build on what you guys are laying down in regards to Black economics and that exchange?
Yeah, so I think that, so what you were talking about is like the whole thing with defund the police. Part of the reason why the Black Panthers were so successful, and of course the government pulled the rug out from under them intentionally, tore them down. But the thing is it's a both and. It's not only do we have people that can create systems of accountability and how we treat and love and respect one another, but you also create systems that give people what they need to thrive, so there's not a reason to even go there in the first place. Because if people have what they need to thrive, I'm not talking about surviving, I'm talking about thriving.
Thriving.
That's a difference. So I'm talking about thriving. When people have what they need to thrive, all the quote-unquote criminal pathologies, a huge amount of them dramatically decrease. Dramatically decrease. People aren't self-medicating because they don't have what they need. People aren't acting out of irrational behaviors or overreacting because they have what they need. People aren't being worried half to death because they have what they need. Their health outcomes, because they have what they need, actually start to normalize. And so there's health that comes in when people have what they need. And I think for the Black community, us creating a system of economics has to be created on a system, because I'm also a realist, that we're not going to be tearing down capitalism tomorrow. It's not going to happen. So how do we use the capitalist system in a way that we can actually, without doing the least amount of harm possible to people, create forms and systems of wealth, but when they're actually directly coming into our community, how we disseminate that, how we collectively take care of one another is very different. That's the strategy that CIP tries to infuse in all the work that we do. And so this whole ideology, we got Black folks now. There's a project that's going on in our neighborhood, and they were talking, and the contract was given to a white artist. I started, of course, doing what I do. Why is this white man coming into a predominantly Black and brown space, drawing, doing artwork in our community? Could you not find Black artists? And we had Black people that were on the board saying, well, I don't see what's wrong with it, and get some of the Black youth in the neighborhood and they ought to do it for free. And I'm like, we're in the middle of COVID. Now, pre-COVID, we were spiraling down. We were. But now we're in the middle of COVID, and you're asking kids who are coming from households of people who are working at hourly wages before COVID, and of which a lot of them no longer are working right now because they didn't work for essential businesses. Or if they did, are at high risk for COVID, and we're being hit with COVID right now, by the way, in East Durham. It's a resurgence in our community right now because we're the ones that, in some of the essential workers, they're not providing personal protective equipment or anything else. So all this stuff is going on, and you asking our kids in our neighborhood to work for free for a major white-led organization that has basically millions upon millions of dollars. There's a disconnect. This was black people saying this. There's a disconnect that even come out of your mouth to say something like that. And so my question is this. This is the part of it. I get a little, how are we supposed to work with that? Because how can I be in a room with someone like that who is so bought into white supremacy and devaluing ourselves as a people? There's no way in my mind I can come. So I have to go where I can actually breathe and live and protect, and so I can sleep at night and wake up with a clear conscience that I'm not abusing and oppressing my own people. And so when we come from these types of different trajectories, we have swallowed white supremacy whole. There's going to have to be a huge amount of conversations and how we even having conversations about how much is enough. So in CIP, we've had these conversations with our board. I have a salary cap. I will never make above a certain amount as an executive director. And if another executive director comes behind me, that'll be the same thing for them. That's the way it is. And it doesn't mean that I'll only get enough just to survive, but thriving. You have to, as working in this black liberating space, you have to be okay with thriving. Because the American dream is not thriving. The American dream is based on me, getting everything I can and be damned anybody else. And so we have to have these conversations about what does it mean to have an income based upon the average medium income and a little bit more for the area that you live in. And making sure that and the minimum wage is not a living wage, but actually $25 an hour plus benefits. That's where we need to start. Because you can't live in Durham off a living wage. There's no way you can live. You can't live, you have to be way out in the county, even if you can find a space for $15 an hour and you don't have any benefits, that's not gonna work. And even $18 an hour with benefits, that's not gonna work either in Durham. It's just not. The AMI for city center neighborhoods in downtown Durham last year was 81,000. That was in 2019. And the numbers I think will come out at some point at the end of the summer, at the beginning. And Farad, which is one of the business experts in Durham, has stated over and over again that we're on track to be at either between 89,000 and 91 for 2020. Now, how many black and brown households do you know collectively all make 81,000 or between $81,000 and $91,000 annually? That's where we are. The AMI and the food co-op and in communities in partnership hovers anywhere between 18,000 and 24,000 a year for households. People can't even survive off of that. We're not even at survival mode right now. We're at a huge deficit, and you expect people to send their children to learn a craft for no money. And this is coming out of our people's mouths.
Wow. That hits hard. Ernest, you got anything to add to that?
I don't need to. Again, we're bumping up against that idea of we're in a system that is severely broken, and we're trying to navigate it and make it work when it's broken, and it's producing the effects that she describes, and without having to, tear it down completely, we've got to figure out how to do it, because as you described in Oakland, it was working. It
was.
Whenever there seems to be national leaders or groups who start to push towards something that will work for our people. When Martin Luther King started talking about, the Poor People's Campaign and talking about that, he was killed, right? And so when we start talking about things that are going to be bring in equity, equality, and it just the system breaks it down as soon as it can. You know, and so again, back to this point, this is why, because of the pandemic, because of you know, the protests, this is a time we can reimagine something. We can think about, because things are at a place where it can be reimagined, where we wouldn't have been able to think about it before now. But now we can start to reimagine how can we build something that would serve all the Black people of Durham? How can we build Black Durham in a way? And we need people coming together to talk about it and educate ourselves on what we can do.
And I'll add this too, because I think what Ernest is talking about, there's a really great clip that's been going around on Facebook about it's African American Black Lives Matter movement builder, I think in Minneapolis, talking about the reason why it's okay for basically the empire to burn. And it was the most succinct retelling of racial inequality in the history of our people that I've heard in a long time, in a very short period of time. But the reality is we don't own anything. And every single time, so the bootstrap mentality, so America is nothing that it thinks it is or says, and neither is white liberalism or anything else, because historically, over and over again, when Black people have come together and built a system to support us, to maintain, and it hasn't been perfect, but it was working for our people. What does whiteness do? It comes in and it rips it apart, often very violently. And so you can rip something apart without totally killing folk too, by the way. So that also says something, that you come in with that level of violence. So that's a whole nother layer of a lie. Because at the end of the day, and I've said this in multiple white spaces, white people have a huge problem with economic parity from Black people. It is a huge issue that white people, it does something, and I've sat and I've seen it, just like this little screw, it's like you're just taking the knife and turning it. White people do not want us to have parity. Every time the Black community, especially as a collective, they'll allow some Black people here and there, because in their minds, that justifies them being who they are. But allowing us as a collective to actually have, as a whole people, what we need to thrive, whiteness will never allow that. But it's very important for us to rebuild those systems for our people. If we don't do it, we are putting ourselves, you're talking about the food system. Whoever owns your food system owns your health and your ability to live healthy. Whoever owns your housing owns not only your health outcome, but your ability to gain wealth. Because what have they done? They've redlined the community. Redlining is still going on. Whoever owns your commerce, your ability to build businesses, holds the purse strings on how you can grow or if you go out of business. If we do not figure out a way how to have our own wealth as a community and learn that the ice is just as cool, and in my opinion is way cooler on our side of town, we are inching towards a precipice. It's like a decision day. And I think we've seen this because white America, for the most part, not all white people feel this way, and we know that, but as a collective, how the system is operated, it hasn't had the outcome that a lot of the quote-unquote white liberals have said they wanted to have. So all we have to show for it is the outcomes right now. So I'm not listening to what you say to me, I'm looking at what you've done. And so unless we have our own space and value ourselves and trust ourselves and allow ourselves to make mistakes and to collectively pick ourselves up over and over again, we're going to be in a mess. Because the only way for us, we are not healed enough. None of us in this nation are healed enough to have this. And we have never had an integrative system. We never have. And we're going to have, in my opinion, to go back to some form of segregation in some areas. That's the only way, because we have too many Black folks that love whiteness better than they do the air they breathe.
Yeah, that was actually my next question, was about self-segregation in regards to treating our health, thinking about food, going into health, like you mentioned, particularly mental health. And so I guess this is my wife, she's studying to be a social worker. She's worked with, those that are struggling with addiction in Durham, and just thinking through that in Durham, she's had some experience. And so you guys, and I'll just say it because we're talking, you guys are well aware of TROSA and Rescue Mission in their work. Okay, that's a whole documentary, if I can keep it 100, that needs to be done. But
individual documentaries.
Yes, that's, and again, goes back to our hands. We haven't been able to give Black Durham a replacement, right, to those things. And so again, we're critiquing, but then we're also aware that many would say, well, what are you going to bring to the table to replace it? And so again, I'm like, okay, fair, all right, touche. But when it comes to mental health, there's this, it feels like a renaissance in this conversation. Like, and I hear it dismissive in some way, but then I say, Black people, you don't do mental health, come to the table, counsel therapy. And I mean, my wife had a lot of conversations like this where you feel like, Black community is being invited into these mental health spaces because we haven't dealt with mental health. But then I grew up around Black moms and kitchens and uncles playing spades at card tables, and even guys coming home from prison and deacons in the room with, felons, and just thinking about the milieu of moms. And I was like, wow, there was a lot of conversations about mental health. And so it feels like, it's one of those issues that we as a community haven't been able to decide. So, but many in our community say, Black people don't do mental health. You're not expressive, you're not. And so we have trauma, right? There's all that there. But I think the way that the lens that we're using to determine, okay, this is awful, comparing it to whites, comparing it to white psychology, where I, read a lot of Black psychologists, Naheem Akbar, in Black psychology that gets into the psychological change right from slavery. So I don't see a lot of that when people talk about mental health. It's like, okay, deal with your trauma, or deal with why you can't snitch, or deal with we're not willing to bring it back, to bring it up. So again, mental health is complex, it's confusing, and I think our community is not even clear on how that even feels, looks.
So what you were saying brought me to a book. We did this group a while back. It's been, 8 years ago?
Yeah, probably.
Based on Disintegration by
Eugene Robinson.
He talked about how prior to integration, the Black community as a whole, we had those who had means with those who didn't have means. The chancellor at NCCU was in the same neighborhood as the folks who were janitors at the school, right? And so, but once integration came about, those who could left the Black community, left a hole, and he calls those who were left, I forget what the term he used.
The abandoned class.
The abandoned class.
Which is a deficit.
And that created some of the things that we see in society today. And what you were describing, the time with the deacons and those who had been in the home with the moms and everyone, there was a sense of wholeness at some point in our community. But we have separated to the point where we've lost that wholeness, and that creates some mental health challenges that we're dealing with, and will this system of government, this systemic nature of white supremacy, allow us to come together in a way where we can be whole, right? And so once we are interacting with each other from a level of understanding and being together, I think there's that self-segregation that you talked about. I think there's a way to bring some wholeness. And that one of the thoughts that you were talking about when we talked about Oakland a few minutes ago, I thought about Soul City. You know about Soul City,
I've heard about
right? And so there was an effort back in the 70s where this was self-segregation, and where we could build a community where we could be together, right? And so I think that togetherness across class, and so you're going to ask folks who are of means to give up something, and
Sure.
how many of them are willing to do that? That's the question. How many of them are willing to step down and for the good of the whole? And that's something that our society has not yet put as a priority to make happen. I just wanted to add that little point in.
I appreciate that, and I think Camryn, Ernest, both of you guys have been phenomenal today and helping us think through how to cross those barriers and boundaries. We'll definitely look forward to more interaction as we continue to talk about this as a community. To the viewers, I thank you for tuning in, and I'll give both of you a final word, and just give us your hope for Durham from this moment forward. Give Durham a charge. If you had to call Durham to it, what would that be right now?
So, Camryn is the wordsmith, and Camryn, I appreciate the wisdom that she has. But what I would say is that we have a moment here where we can reimagine what Durham can be. We can begin to think about, how we can be together. And I'm speaking particularly to Black Durham. We need to break out of the molds that we've had in the past, and we need to begin to see ourselves as a whole community, working together. And I think, I've hesitated to say this because I know some people will take this little tidbit and use it to undermine. I've been on my own journey, and I know people are on their own journey. If you come to me with this conversation 20 years ago, I wouldn't have been there to receive it. And so I know there's some people where I was 20 years ago. And so we've got to find a way to help them move along. But we need them to move along a lot quicker than it took the time it took me to get to where I am, to understand that, this system of oppression is really tearing us down. And I think this is a moment, I think back, especially in Durham, because of the work of OAR Durham, where we've had a lot of people going through the REI trainings to understand, to help them break through this mold of understanding what the system of oppression actually is. So we can move if we just be patient with each other, come together, and begin to break the system that's in place.
And I think the challenge is everybody, piggybacking on what Ernest was saying about everybody going through their training, and training is a check off the box. Unless we're actually operationalizing equity, then we're just talking, and we're nothing about who we say we are. And so I think Durham, I go back to this thing that I've been saying over and over again, Durham is a really good talking game, but when you look at the data on the outcomes of actually who's building wealth and who has power and who has control, it is nothing connected to who we say we are. Again, I don't listen to what you say, I'm looking at what you do. And now we have academics. Dr. Sandy Darity's been doing this work for a long time. He's been telling the story. Dr. Henry McCoy's now doing the work, showing us who we are. So you're not going to get different outcomes keeping on doing the same thing. And so it's time for Durham to either be who we say we are or to admit what we're not, and to stop telling a lie. That's the reality. And I think there's enough folks in different positions and in communities that are tired, because we see a dramatic wealth disparity that was created even pre-COVID, and now whiteness is going to take advantage of a lot of the folks that are in distress, people that might be losing their homes. So are we going to think of another system to kind of upend that so that we can be equitable and actually infuse some liberated practices? Or are we going to keep on doing the same old, same old? Because my husband's an attorney. I've heard multiple attorneys say to me, there's always a way to work around the legalities. The legal system was built off of what? White supremacy. What benefited white men in creating structures that protected their wealth and power. That's what it is, period, at the end of the day. There is some moral justification and some moral compasses involved in some of the policies and laws. But at the end of the day, especially have we not seen how this administration and how the North Carolina legislature has worked, they twist and bend laws to basically pivot how they can maintain power, access, and control. So at the end of the day, we can make it work. This is for Durham. We can make it work. I think Durham is the one city in the state of North Carolina, and probably in the Southeast, that we can actually make this work. Are people willing to give power and be who they say they are? Or are they going to keep on doing the same thing over and over again? And that includes black people who have power too. Are they going to keep on bowing down to the same structures and the powers that be, and to keep their people from moving to a level from we're at negative survival mode to a place where we can at least breathe and moving towards thriving? I want my people thriving. That's what I want.
Camryn and Ernest, this has been beautiful. Thank you. You are a gift and a treasure to Durham. The folks watching, check us out next week. This has been Let's Rap. Peace.